The victories did not slow the arguments. They sharpened them. By September 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. American armies advanced rapidly, exploiting German collapse and capturing ground at a pace unseen earlier in the campaign. British and Commonwealth forces moved more deliberately in the north, consolidating positions and protecting extended supply lines. The differences were not accidental. Bernard Montgomery favored tightly controlled operations, clear fronts, and deliberate buildup. He believed speed without coordination invited disaster. American commanders, backed by overwhelming resources, pushed for momentum. They saw opportunity in German disarray and wanted to keep pressure constant. At Supreme Headquarters, these approaches collided. Briefings grew tense. Maps filled with arrows pointing in different directions. Requests for fuel, trucks, and air support exceeded what the logistics system could provide. Every ton sent to one army was a ton denied to another. Credit became another fault line. American successes drew headlines and political attention. Montgomery, who had commanded ground forces during the invasion, watched influence slip away as operational control shifted westward. He argued that fragmented command diluted effectiveness and endangered the overall plan. The celebrated American general at the center of the advance became a symbol of this shift. His forces moved fast, sometimes faster than coordination allowed. To Montgomery, this was not boldness, but risk. Reports emphasized exposed flanks and strained supply columns. Praise and criticism traveled along the same channels. By early autumn, the rivalry was no longer theoretical. It was shaping decisions, priorities, and trust. And beneath the formal language of coalition warfare, pressure was building toward a confrontation neither side could easily avoid. Success created distance instead of agreement. In August and September 1944, the Allied advance moved out of the Normandy lodgment and into open country. German forces were retreating east, abandoning equipment and positions. American armies, particularly 1st and 3rd Army, drove hard across France, capturing cities, bridges, and road networks in rapid succession. Montgomery viewed the situation differently. From his headquarters in northern France, he assessed stretched supply lines and thinly held flanks. Fuel and ammunition were finite. Ports were damaged. Roads were clogged with traffic. He argued that the advance needed focus, not speed, and that resources should be concentrated on a single, controlled thrust. At Supreme Headquarters, these views collided daily. Maps were redrawn. Priorities shifted and shifted again. Requests for fuel convoys, bridging units, and air support piled up faster than they could be approved. Every decision carried political weight because success translated directly into influence. American commanders pressed their advantage. Their units were moving, fighting, and winning. They resisted any plan that slowed them or placed their forces under tighter British control. Montgomery, meanwhile, believed fragmented authority threatened the coherence of the campaign and undermined his role as senior ground commander. The dispute moved beyond strategy. Credit for victories became contested. Reports were scrutinized. Performance was compared. Praise from London and Washington landed unevenly, and resentment followed. What had begun as professional disagreement hardened into personal friction. By early autumn, the Allied command structure remained intact, but the trust holding it together was thinning, one decision at a time. Attention narrowed toward one man. By early September 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing at extraordinary speed. After breaking out of Normandy, his columns crossed the Seine, liberated much of central France, and drove east with minimal pause. Towns fell in days. German rear guards dissolved. The advance dominated reports flowing back to Washington. Patton's methods were direct. He pushed armor forward aggressively, accepted exposed flanks, and relied on momentum to keep German forces off balance. Fuel shortages slowed him briefly, then lifted. When supplies arrived, the advance resumed immediately. The results were measurable in miles gained and enemy units displaced. To Montgomery, this approach appeared reckless. From his perspective, coordination mattered more than speed. He watched Patton's movements stretch supply lines and complicate air and logistical planning. British commanders worried that success without central control weakened their influence and risked a sudden reversal if German resistance stiffened. assessments began circulating through Allied staff channels. They emphasized uneven coordination, competition for resources, and command imbalance. Patton's public profile, amplified by press coverage, added strain. Victories brought attention, and attention translated into leverage. Within headquarters, discussion shifted subtly. It was no longer about routes or depots alone. It was about authority. Who set priorities? Who accepted risk on behalf of the alliance? Who answered when speed collided with structure? Patton continued moving east. His forces pressed forward, consuming fuel as fast as it could be delivered. Each mile gained strengthened his position, and each report sharpened Montgomery's concerns. The gap between operational success and command cohesion widened quietly, while the question of control remained unanswered. The tempo began to slow, but the pressure did not. By October 1944, the Allied advance had outrun its supply system. Fuel shortages halted armored columns. Ammunition stocks tightened. Damaged ports along the channel were still being repaired, and Antwerp, though captured, remained unusable while German forces controlled its approaches. The front stretched hundreds of miles from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Montgomery saw an opening. From his headquarters, he argued that dispersed advances wasted scarce resources. He proposed a reorganization of command and supply priorities, concentrating strength under a single, unified thrust in the north. The structure placed his command at the center of decision-making. On paper, the proposal emphasized efficiency, fewer competing demands, clear lines of authority, better use of limited fuel and transport. In practice, it reduced the independence of American field commanders whose armies were already engaged deep inside Germany's outer defenses. The implications were immediately understood. Control of supply meant control of tempo. Control of tempo meant influence over the final shape of the campaign. American commanders recognized that acceptance would slow their advances and subordinate their operational freedom to British oversight. Staff officers exchanged memoranda. Planning charts were revised. The tone of discussions shifted from cooperative to guarded. Careers and reputations hung in the balance, though nothing was stated openly. National governments watched closely, aware that battlefield authority translated directly into post-war standing. Montgomery pressed his case with persistence. He believed unity required direction, and direction required him. The Americans resisted quietly, but firmly, unwilling to surrender momentum or command without protest. As autumn deepened, the logistical crisis remained unresolved. So did the question of who would shape the final drive into Germany. The command structure held, but strain was now visible along every joint. The dispute crossed a line that could not be easily reversed. In October 1944, as Allied momentum slowed along several sectors, frustration found a target. German resistance stiffened near the Siegfried Line. Weather-grounded aircraft. Fuel shortages returned. What had been explained as temporary strain now appeared, to some, as proof of flawed leadership. From his headquarters, Montgomery formalized his position. He argued that coalition effectiveness required firmer control and fewer independent actors. The American general at the center of recent advances was identified as a liability to cohesion. The recommendation was clear. Authority should be removed or sharply reduced in the interest of discipline and caution. The proposal reached Supreme Headquarters quickly. It carried weight because it came from a senior field marshal with political backing in London. Staff officers understood what it meant. This was not a planning disagreement. It was a request to end a command career in the middle of a war. The reaction was immediate and tense. American officers pushed back through official channels, warning that such a move would damage morale and fracture trust. The general's record was examined line by line. Achievements were balanced against risks. Nothing about the moment felt routine. Eisenhower now faced the issue directly. Accepting the recommendation might placate Montgomery and simplify command on paper. Rejecting it risked a rupture with Britain's most prominent battlefield commander. The decision carried military, political, and personal consequences. Headquarters grew quiet as messages slowed and drafts were reconsidered. Outside, divisions held their lines and prepared for winter. Inside, the future of the Allied command rested on a judgment that could not be delayed much longer. The responsibility settled where it always did. In October 1944, Eisenhower operated from Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, balancing a coalition that stretched from Washington to London. The front was long. The weather was turning. German defenses along the West Wall were hardening, and intelligence reports warned that reserves were being repositioned for counteraction. The recommendation to remove the American general forced competing risks into the open. Politically, dismissal would reverberate in the United States, where Congress and the press followed battlefield leadership closely. Militarily, it threatened to disrupt an army already engaged forward, dependent on continuity and trust. Morale across American formations could not be easily repaired. Yet rejecting Montgomery carried its own cost. British cooperation remained essential for air operations, logistics, and public unity. Montgomery commanded loyalty in London and among Commonwealth forces. Open defiance risked resentment, obstruction, or quiet withdrawal of support at critical moments. Eisenhower consulted constantly. Senior staff weighed operational consequences against alliance stability. Cables crossed the Atlantic. Draft responses were prepared, then set aside. Each option solved one problem while opening another. Time worked against caution. German resistance intensified in key sectors. Units waited for fuel allocations and operational guidance. Delayed decisions slowed planning cycles and blurred authority at the front. Indecision began to register as a weakness rather than prudence. Eisenhower understood that command cohesion depended not only on structures, but on confidence. Removing a successful commander could fracture that confidence. Keeping him risked alienating a powerful ally. As October wore on, the question remained unresolved. The war pressed forward regardless, while at headquarters the burden of choice grew heavier, narrowing the space for compromise with every passing day. The arguments continued, but the war did not pause for them. In late October and early November 1944, fighting intensified along the Allied front. American units pressed against the West Wall near Aachen and the Hurtgen Forest. British and Canadian forces fought to clear approaches toward the Rhine. Progress was measured in yards. Losses accumulated quietly, recorded in daily reports. While headquarters debated command authority, soldiers remained committed to existing orders. Infantry companies rotated through shattered villages. Armored units waited for fuel, then moved again under artillery fire. Weather worsened. Rain turned roads into mud. Casualty lists lengthened without ceremony. In Washington and London, senior leaders followed the dispute closely. None wanted a public fracture inside the alliance. Press coverage remained restrained, but concern was constant. Removing a senior American commander in the midst of sustained combat risked shock waves far beyond the front. The American general's operational record complicated every calculation. Despite logistical limits, his formations continued to engage German forces effectively. Enemy withdrawals and captured ground appeared in situation maps each week. These results made it harder to justify disruption, even as concerns about coordination persisted. At Supreme Headquarters, the contrast was stark. Conference rooms filled with charts and memoranda. Outside, trucks carried wounded men west while replacements moved east. The cost of delay was no longer theoretical. Every day, without clarity, meant continued fighting under strained authority. Eisenhower absorbed these realities in fragments. Casualty summaries, after-action reports, requests for reinforcements. Each document tied abstract decisions to individual outcomes. The pressure shifted subtly. What began as a question of command structure now carried visible human weight. As November advanced, the dispute remained unresolved, while the front continued to consume time, resources, and lives with steady indifference. The decision came without ceremony. In early November 1944, Eisenhower made his position clear through formal channels. The American general would remain in command. The existing structure would stand. No removal, no reduction in authority. The coalition would continue as it was, imperfect but intact. The message moved quickly through headquarters. Staff officers adjusted plans. Supply allocations were confirmed. Operational boundaries were left unchanged. What mattered most was clarity. Uncertainty, which had lingered for weeks, finally receded. Montgomery did not hide his dissatisfaction. His arguments had been rejected, and with them his bid to reshape the command balance. Yet the decision was final. Eisenhower framed it as a matter of cohesion, not preference. The alliance required mutual confidence, even when trust was strained. At the front, the effects were practical rather than dramatic. American units continued their operations along the West Wall. British and Canadian forces maintained pressure in the north. Planning resumed, with fewer caveats. Orders no longer carried the unspoken question of who might be removed next. The American general remained focused on immediate objectives. His staff refined supply schedules and coordinated with neighboring commands. The momentum, though slowed by weather and terrain, did not collapse. German resistance remained strong, but Allied coordination improved. Inside Supreme Headquarters, the atmosphere shifted. Disagreement had not vanished, but authority was no longer contested. The chain of command was settled, at least for now. The refusal closed one path and left others untouched. The war moved forward under winter skies, while unresolved tensions lingered beneath the surface, waiting for the next strain to test the balance Eisenhower had chosen to preserve. The decision settled the command question, but it did not erase the strain. Through November and December 1944, Allied operations continued under the same structure, yet relationships had shifted. Montgomery retained command of his forces, but his ability to dictate overall strategy was reduced. Supreme Headquarters asserted tighter coordination, and American operational weight became harder to counterbalance. Planning meetings grew more formal. Arguments were measured. Proposals were filtered carefully before reaching Eisenhower. The latitude Montgomery once exercised narrowed, replaced by negotiated boundaries that reflected changed realities on the ground. British forces remained essential, but no longer dominant in setting tempo. American leadership consolidated quietly. Supply priorities increasingly favored U.S. armies driving toward the Rhine. Logistical networks adjusted to support sustained pressure across multiple sectors rather than a single concentrated thrust. This approach spread resources thin, but it aligned with Eisenhower's vision of coalition balance. At the front, the consequences were mixed. Coordination improved, but friction remained. Units fought through winter conditions, navigating mud, snow, and stiffening German resistance. The command dispute faded from immediate view, yet its imprint remained in how decisions were framed and authority exercised. Reputations began to harden. Montgomery's role was reassessed in both London and Washington, his successes acknowledged alongside his limitations. The American general emerged strengthened, not because of politics, but because continuity had preserved results under pressure. No public reckoning followed. The alliance held, and operations pressed eastward. But beneath the surface, memories of the crisis endured, shaping trust and restraint in the war's final months, as the Allied command moved forward with less margin for error than before. The front kept moving, and the command endured. By early 1945, Allied forces were approaching the Rhine under a unified structure that had survived its sharpest internal test. The winter battles had strained every army. Supply systems were battered. Casualties were heavy. Yet the coalition held its shape through the most demanding phase of the campaign. Eisenhower's refusal had settled more than a personnel dispute. It fixed the terms of Allied leadership. Authority rested not on national prestige or battlefield audacity alone, but on balance between partners who needed one another to finish the war. Decisions flowed through a clearer chain. Disagreements still surfaced, but they no longer threatened rupture. Montgomery remained an effective field commander, executing operations within defined limits. American generals continued to drive forward with weight and scale. Neither side achieved complete dominance. That restraint proved decisive as the Allies crossed the Rhine, encircled German forces, and pushed into the heart of the Reich. The war's final months confirmed what the crisis had revealed. Coalition warfare rewarded steadiness more than brilliance. It punished pride faster than caution. Eisenhower absorbed pressure from both sides and chose cohesion when division might have felt easier in the moment. No announcement marked the significance of the choice. There was no public reckoning. But the outcome was visible in the continuity of command, the alignment of effort, and the steady collapse of German resistance across the Western Front. Leadership under fire did not mean winning arguments. It meant carrying the weight of competing ambitions and keeping the alliance intact long enough to achieve its purpose. In that balance, the Allies found the stability required to bring the war in Europe to its close.